We now come to the general debate on the infected blood inquiry. I call the Minister to move.
I beg to move the motion standing on the order paper, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for this opportunity to come before the House to update on this vital issue and discuss the findings of the Infected Blood Inquiry's final report. We are now almost 6 months on from the publication of that report. And I'm pleased to have my right honourable friend, Minister Glen, on the front bench with me today. He will lead on the elements of the inquiry report that are a matter for the Department for Health and Social Care. And we are as one in our determination to drive forward this vital work and deliver action on the findings of the Infected Blood Inquiry's report. It is, Madam Deputy Speaker, the very least that the infected and affected victims of this appalling injustice deserve. Now, as members, honourable and right honourable members, will be aware, I have made a number of statements to this House regarding the progress the Government has made on the compensation scheme. Today is an opportunity to go beyond that and cover the wider issues raised in Sir Brian Langstaff's report. And I'm grateful to colleagues across the House for their engagement on this matter. And I know that we are united as a House in seeking to deliver justice insofar as it is possible for this terrible scandal. We will not shy away from the appalling findings of the inquiry's report and the horrors that have been inflicted upon the infected blood community. I reiterate my thanks today to Sir Brian Langstaff and his team for that comprehensive report. And crucially, I thank the community themselves. I recognise the anger and the mistrust many quite understandably hold towards public institutions that have let so many people down so badly. When the Infected Blood Inquiry reported in May, the now Prime Minister and I were clear that an apology was meaningful only if it is accompanied by action. And it is action we are taking. That is why I was so determined to move quickly to establish the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme, and why I expect to see payments begin by the end of this year. The Prime Minister committed to delivering the Hillsborough Law to help address the institutional defensiveness so powerfully exposed by Sir Brian's report. And today, I want to update on the work we are driving forward across the other key findings of that report to do everything possible to ensure an injustice such as this can never be allowed to happen again. I welcome the fact that my colleague and friend, the Chancellor, for the very first time, provided specific funding for the compensation fund, £11.8 billion in the budget. That makes clear the scale of this government's commitment to justice, and I am proud that we are driving that work forward. Compensation delayed for generations will be delivered. And I give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, but whilst it's paying tribute to Sir Brian Langstaff, which obviously everyone should be grateful to him for what he has done, but in recommendation 14 in his second interim report, he was quite clear about the advisory or the body that deals with compensation should be at arm's length from government. It should be chaired by a judge who has completely independent and sole decision-making powers. Does the government accept the core of that recommendation?
Well, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has operational independence. Of course, the government has stewardship for the amount of money that has been allocated here. And as my honourable friend will appreciate, the £11.8 billion that has been allocated to this is a huge and substantial commitment. I don't pretend for a moment that any amount of money can actually recompense for the scale of the injustice that we have seen. But that is, at the same time, an indication of the government, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and across the government, an indication of our commitment to deliver justice. And I should also say that in saying that, I'm also grateful for the work and cooperation of honourable members across the House. And in particular, I want to once again thank the Right Honourable Member for Salisbury, my predecessor as Paymaster General, for his efforts in government. And as I indicated in the debate last week, I look forward to continuing to work in that spirit with the new Shadow Paymaster General on this hugely important issue. I also want to thank my ministerial colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North and Cottingham, and the previous member for Worthing West. Their tireless campaigning and representation of the community's interests has been invaluable over so many years. Now, much progress has been made in responding to Sir Brian's report, but much more remains to do. And I will set out the government's fuller response to the recommendations to the House in line with the timetable that Sir Brian has set out. But I do hope in the course of the debate today to assure honourable and right honourable members, and most importantly those in the community, that we have listened, we have learned, and we are taking long overdue action. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the inquiry's report is persistent in uncovering the truth, unshakable in its honesty, and damning, frankly, in its criticisms. It is absolutely clear that fundamental responsibilities of patient safety in healthcare were repeatedly ignored, and I quote, "What happened would not have happened if safety of the patient had been paramount throughout." This culture of willful ignorance runs through the report and continued to proliferate as the scandal developed. It speaks to governments across decades and a state more focused on discharging its functions, whatever the risk and whatever the cost. And the report chronicles suffering of an almost unimaginable scale. Thousands of people died prematurely and continue to die every week. Lives completely shattered, evidence destroyed, victims undermined, families devastated, and children used as objects of research. It's a truly horrifying injustice. Yet Sir Brian's report, Madam Deputy Speaker, goes much further. He lays bare the institutional defensiveness that existed within the government and indeed the civil service that led to the truth being hidden for so long, compounding the pain and the injustice. Sir Brian highlights, and I quote, "the consequences of civil servants and ministers adopting lines to take without sufficient reflection, when they were inaccurate, partial when they should have been qualified, had no proper evidential foundation, and made unrealistic claims that treatment had been the best it could be." These actions are the very antithesis of public service. And that is why I know there is such collective determination to learn the right lessons and to act on them. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is so much that can be said about the volumes of evidence that Sir Brian has uncovered. And I know through the course of the debate today, many members here will raise important and vital issues. But let me be absolutely clear. The report details utterly unacceptable failings on a chilling scale, and this government will do everything in its power to address them. And through acting on these lessons, we must ensure that all those who have suffered and those who've campaigned have not done so in vain. I turn now, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the 12 recommendations the inquiry makes in its report, and I'd like to touch briefly on the progress that has already been made. I know members across the House are keen to hear the details of what the government intends to do in response. The recommendations are wide-ranging. They are being given full consideration, and as I've already indicated, I will provide an update to Parliament by the end of the year against each and every one of the recommendations. Now, firstly, on compensation, I have updated the House already on a number of occasions of the progress that is being made. And following the debate in this House on the regulations we have made to establish the Infected Blood Compensation Authority and the core route for compensation for infected people, I am grateful to honourable and right honourable members across the House for their contributions to that debate, but also, crucially, for the support there's been across the House to ensure that the delivery of compensation is not delayed in any way by Parliament. Now, I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. What assurances can be offered that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has sufficient staffing and resources at their disposal to meet expectations of the swift payments promised by the Government?
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I can assure her that the Government will ensure that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has that support that it needs. I expect the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to be making the first payments to infected people by the end of the year and start making payments for affected people next year. And indeed, further regulations will be required for people who are affected, but it will not disturb that timetable that I've set out. And I say to the House, I intend that that second set of regulations will be in force by the 31st of March next year. Over £1 billion has already been paid out in interim compensation, and the Government has opened applications for interim payments of £100,000 to the estates of deceased people who were infected with contaminated blood or blood products and have not yet been recognised. I'll give way.
Thank you to me, honourable friend, for giving way. Last week I had a constituent who came to the office whose mother died 50 years ago after a blood transfusion, giving birth to a fourth son. She died 8 months later. When the family have gone back in to get the medical records, they've all been destroyed. All the medical records have been destroyed. When we talk about the cover-up, obviously they're making that link quite rightly. Is there anything the government can say to reassure my constituent that her case will be heard?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and indeed the Infected Blood Compensation Authority will obviously take, and I know because of the discussions I have with Sir Robert Francis on this, a sympathetic view to the level of evidence that is going to be required, because in some cases it is because the issues complained of are so long ago. But what is another chilling aspect of this scandal is willful destruction of documents in some cases, and it's something we have to take into account in terms of securing justice for people. Indeed, I've had the privilege myself of meeting several members of the community, and I'm grateful to them for continuing to campaign on this issue. And I say openly as well, my gratitude to Sir Robert Francis and David Foley of the Infected Blood Compensation Authority as they continue to work with the community to drive that delivery of compensation forward. Ending the defensive culture in the civil service and government is a cultural change that should unite all of us across public life. It's why work is underway across government to strengthen responsibilities around candour and transparency for public servants. In the King's speech that opened this Parliament, the Government set out its commitment to bring forward legislation to introduce a duty of candour for public authorities and public servants. The Prime Minister confirmed at the party conference that legislation on a duty of candour will be delivered. And to quote the Prime Minister's words, he said, "It is a law for the sub-postmasters in the Horizon scandal, the victims of infected blood, Windrush, Grenfell Tower, and all the countless injustices over the years suffered by working people at the hands of those who were supposed to serve them. Our Hillsborough law, as the Prime Minister said, will be introduced to Parliament before the anniversary of Hillsborough on the 15th of April next year. I will give way.
I'd like to thank you for the comment. I'd like to thank the Minister for the comments. A constituent of Clwyd East has contacted me recently to talk about the death of a husband who contracted hepatitis C as a result of infected blood. The impact upon herself and her family has been massive, even with the interim payment that she and they have received. Can the Minister confirm that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority has been established and is undertaking the necessary work to deliver payments to victims of this injustice as soon as possible?
I can confirm that to my honourable friend, and the Infected Blood Compensation Authority is working in a way that will allow it to scale up as quickly as it possibly can. And the need, and I can say to my honourable friend, the need for speed in delivering compensation payments is absolutely paramount. And I should also say on memorialisation, because that is going to be really important to how we remember the victims of this scandal. Sir Brian Langstaff makes a compelling case about the need to recognise what happened to people and for it to be recognised for future generations. Officials have begun the necessary work to respond to Sir Brian's recommendations on memorialisation, and we do move forward recognising that this is an incredibly sensitive issue that we need to get right. Madam Deputy Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations call for fundamental changes to the way that politics and government operates, and a compensation scheme which is one of the very largest in UK history. That is entirely and rightly in line and in keeping with the scale of injustice that he has uncovered. Given the scale of these recommendations, I am committed to formally updating on them within the 12-month time frame, and that is, so the House is aware, the time frame that was set out by Sir Brian Langstaff. But I also want to assure members across the House, and indeed the infected blood community, that we will drive forward this vital work. We will deliver changes that are needed that will stand as a testament to the bravery and determination of people who have been so badly failed. I pay tribute to all those who fought so hard to bring us to this moment. Their efforts are monumental, and we commit again today to ensuring that they have not been in vain. I do commend this matter to the House.
Before I call the Shadow Minister, I wish to make a short statement about the House's sub judice resolution. I understand there are several legal cases relating to contaminated blood products which have not yet concluded. However, given the public interest in this issue, Mr. Speaker is exercising his discretion to allow reference to specific proceedings where necessary, as they concern issues of national importance. The question is that this House has considered the infected blood inquiry. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The infected blood scandal is one of the most painful and shameful chapters in the history of the British state. For decades, hundreds of individuals with bleeding disorders and other conditions were infected with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, due to the use of contaminated blood products such as Factor VIII and Factor IX, often imported from overseas. These infections were not only preventable, but there were warnings from the medical community that were ignored by successive governments and by the National Health Service. The victims and their families have endured unimaginable suffering, including the loss of loved ones, social stigma, and many have even been tragically blamed for their own illnesses. The health service, which was supposed to be there for them, to treat them, to heal them and look after them, and the parts of the state that were supposed to protect them, betrayed them. The institutions of this country failed these victims and their families at such a scale that it is almost beyond comprehension. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased that this subject has been brought forward to be debated today. A subject as important as this deserves to be thoroughly discussed in this House. And as this is my first debate as Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, I would like to put on record that while there will be much that the Right Honourable Gentleman and I will disagree on, this issue is not one of them. He can be sure of our support as he works to put right a historic wrong, a wrong that continues to have a devastating impact on families across the country. It is simply beyond party politics. And I thank the Paymaster General for his update in the House today, and for the tone and the tenor which he has already struck in this place since the general election. The infected blood inquiry established in 2017 by the former Prime Minister Theresa May was only achieved because of the tireless efforts of victims and their families. But that inquiry has shed a horrifying light on the true scale of the tragedy. And I echo the Paymaster General's thanks to Sir Brian and to his team for the great service that they have given in conducting this inquiry. It stands as a testament to the power of the victims' voices and the need for transparency, justice and accountability at all levels. Whilst I'm here today on behalf of His Majesty's opposition, I would like to reiterate the words of the previous Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton, when he apologised not only on behalf of the previous government, but on behalf of governments stretching back to the 1970s. This sentiment, I know, is shared by the current leader of the opposition and the whole of our party. We are truly sorry the successive governments and the NHS failed to listen to the medical experts, victims and their families. And this inquiry shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. A great many of its victims and loved ones have sadly died before they ever saw the truth being acknowledged. I am pleased that this government and our previous government have publicly recognised the scale of the damage done, acknowledged the mistakes that were made, and most importantly, are now taking steps to try to make some amends and to provide support and compensation for its many victims. We on this side of the House will continue to support the government's ambition to make the first payments before the end of this year. It is important that the government is pushing ahead with the compensation scheme, which is of the size and scale which is rightfully deserved by victims, including those who are sadly now deceased, and their families, and that it will take into account all of the medical, financial and emotional suffering. As I have said, he will have our full support on this side of the House. An apology is, as he has said, meaningless without not just redress, but redress at speed. In addition, I also hope that the Right Honourable Gentleman will be working further with the Health Secretary to help implement stronger medical screening protocols, as well as safety measures to ensure that the UK's blood supply continues to be safe and free from contamination. A scandal like this cannot be allowed to ever happen again. And so the government must continue to ensure that global standards for blood safety are met and regularly updated. This includes improving regulations where appropriate around the sourcing of blood products, constantly updating where possible methods for virus detection. It is important that we further enhance training and education for our healthcare professionals regarding ethical practices, patient consent, and the safe use of medical products. And whilst I know that a lot has changed in the National Health Service in the nearly 50 years since the start of the scandal, a key aspect of the total failure was that lack of informed consent, the failure of healthcare professionals to adequately communicate the risks that were associated with treatment. And as this inquiry has shown, there are numerous cases of disrespectful attitudes towards infected patients, completely unacceptable. Patients who are often blamed for their condition or treated as though they are a burden. As the inquiry has recommended, the training must include the ethics procedures as well as patient-centred care. This scandal, sadly, is a painful case study on what happens when this is not the case. Medical staff in the NHS should always approach patients with dignity and empathy, as we know that almost all do on a daily basis, ensuring that all risks and benefits are clearly communicated and the rights of patients are upheld. Adding to this point, and perhaps more broadly in society, we must continue the great work of recent years in destigmatising those with conditions such as HIV and hepatitis. And I note the exceptional work of the Terence Higgins Trust in the former in particular. As has been previously said, the victims of the infected blood scandal were not only victims of the NHS and the many government's failings, but also they were victims of social stigma and discrimination. As the inquiry found, many faced vilification. This despite the fact that many had received contaminated blood products through the same NHS that was blaming them through no fault of their own. And so I encourage the government to continue with public education campaigns to combat that stigma surrounding blood-borne viruses and HIV, as well as implementing better protections in the workplace and public life, so that we can be sure that those infected are not subject to the pain of further discrimination. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to put on record my own thanks. My thanks to the brave victims and their families. As I said at the start of my speech, we would not be here today if it was not for them. Their campaigning, their hard work, their faith to keep going when nothing seemed to be changing, when the message simply didn't seem to be getting through. Their relentlessness to fight, knowing that a great injustice had been done, their love for their friends and family members, many of whom are sadly no longer with us today, who are all impacted by this terrible situation. Their courage is truly awe-inspiring, and no amount of compensation will ever undo the great tragedy. So great is the pain and the suffering which they have been through, but I sincerely hope that moving forward, that perhaps one day they will have some peace. Peace in the knowledge that they have been listened to by their government and their health service, and that all their hard years of campaigning, the abuse and vile vitriol which many have faced, was not for nothing. That in the end, after far, far too long, they have indeed been heard, and that because of all their combined efforts and sacrifices, we can come together now to help make sure that something like this will never happen again. They have moved the nation and this Parliament with their deeply personal stories, and we are all sorry, deeply sorry, for everything that they have been through, for everything and everyone who they have lost. And I thank them all for their extraordinary bravery.
Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the past 3 years alone, I've spoken in this House about the delays the victims of the contaminated blood have faced in obtaining justice and receiving the compensation they deserve at least 10 times. And I've got to say, progress has been painfully slow. And as my right honourable friend stated earlier, there is much anger. There is frustration and mistrust. And that's an issue which we need to deal with. It hasn't gone away. It hasn't been diluted as a result of a general election. People are genuinely, and rightly so, rightly so, are very angry and have a mistrust of anybody that's dealing with compensation for contaminated blood. In May 2024, the inquiry found over 3,000 of those suffering as a result of the scandal had sadly died. The victims continue to die many without receiving compensation at the rate roughly of about 1 every 2 days. So I wouldn't like to calculate how many people have actually died in the last 10 times I've spoken in the House. And between now and the times my right honourable friend mentioned about further legislation, whether we like it or not, there's going to be more people sadly passing on as a result of this scandal. I appreciate that my right honourable friend, the Minister, has only had a few months to try and rectify the consequences of what I can describe only as the previous government's slow response to the inquiry's Chair, Sir Brian Langstaff's demands. But again, I'd urge him to do everything in his power to ensure that the Infected Contaminated Blood Authority hires the staff that's needed to address the challenges and the designs and procedures required with the utmost of urgency. I'm sure that my honourable friend has got the message. I've spoken many times in the House of my own constituent, Sean Cavins, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sean was one of the youngest people in the country to be infected with hepatitis C as a result of being given contaminated blood. He's campaigned tirelessly on behalf of those who, like himself, have found themselves fallen victim to the scandal. Many who have died, as I've mentioned, just simply waiting for justice. At the current rate of settling claims, which is another huge issue, those victims and many others are concerned that many more people will die without ever seeing a halfpenny of compensation for themselves or even their families. The question whether the government is acting quickly enough, with only 270 claims expected to be dealt with by the end of the financial year, and more than that, 4,500 claims in limbo. I think we'll all share their concerns. I'm not sure if it's good enough, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not sure if it's good enough at all. Sean's 43 years of age now. He was infected in 1983 with hepatitis C and other viruses. He wonders whether he fits in the selection process. He'll not be alone in wondering whether he must simply hang on and hope to survive long enough to see justice done for himself and his family. And whilst the scheme currently has no effect on payments made through the infected blood support schemes, this will cease to be the case in the new financial year. I'm hoping that my honourable friend will review this approach and extend the deadline so that people who receive payments after the 31st of March 2025 do not see this deducted from compensation through the new scheme. It's a point, obviously, I would like my honourable friend to consider. Fundamentally, Sean and others are concerned that those currently on the IBSS are not automatically being offered the core route payment. And they're wondering why they cannot be simply offered a lump sum payment equivalent to payments up to the average life expectancy of 86. They're also concerned that the rates to be offered in compensation are rumoured, and I'll underline rumoured, to be only 20% of current annual payments. I'm sure that'll be outlined by my honourable friend in the winding up. The uncertainty regarding the compensation scheme's date of infection criteria is causing concern amongst victims. The burden of proof for those who were infected after screening began for relevant viruses is deemed by the IBCA to be higher, but without any clarification on what that actually means in practice. I'm hoping that the Minister can provide such clarification. Screening began for HIV in November 1985, for hepatitis C in September 1991, but for hepatitis B as early as December 1972. Sean was infected, as I mentioned, with hepatitis B in 1983, and he needs to know how this will affect his final compensation. Will the IBCA take into account that the screening test for hepatitis B in 1983 is estimated to have been only 43% effective? I'll repeat that, it just estimated to have been only 43% effective. Will the IBCA recognise that victims who were treated for hepatitis C were treated with the retroviral drug interferon that has well-known serious side effects on patients' mental health? And will this be reflected in the compensations? Will the Minister confirm that Sir Brian Langstaff's recent guidance is contained in his letter dated to him on the 13th of November 2024 regarding siblings of victims who deserve compensation will be accepted by the IBCA and reflected in any compensated scheme that it designs? And will, as Sir Brian has recommended, any family member whose relationship was so close to the victim that damage to their own mental, physical health caused by witnessing their siblings' suffering was reasonably foreseeable, will they receive full compensation if indeed they were also damaged? It's been reported that the IBCA will only compensate siblings of victims if they lived with the victim in the family unit for a full 2 years. Can the Minister ensure that this arbitrary restriction is not contained in any IBCA compensation scheme? And can the Minister confirm that the family of any victim who dies before his or her application to the IBCA has been completed will receive full compensation? There's indications that the IBCA has interpreted the inquiry's final report as saying the contrary, and that it only intends to pay those who live long enough to receive a final award. This cannot in any way, shape or form be correct. It's not fair, it's not just. Will the Minister ensure that those who were purposefully infected as children with contaminated blood in the name of medical research are awarded enhanced punitive levels of compensation to reflect the country's abhorrence of such horrific criminal behaviour carried out by medical professions who were sworn to dedicate themselves to healing the sick? Madam Deputy Speaker, this is one thing I just cannot understand, that this whole tragic scandal is an absolute disgrace, but what is really abhorrent is the fact that this country, this great country of ours, actually used children that high. They experimented on children that high, and those children, many who haven't survived, really deserve the compensation. And it obviously is to be determined how much, and has been stated what the compensation should be, and I would ask the Minister whether or not that, bear in mind the abhorrence, the nature of what we've done as a nation, is actually enough. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the infected contaminated blood scandal is just one of far too many injustices in the UK over recent decades, in which powerful people have treated institutional reputations, career prospects, and in a number of cases profits as being more important than working class lives. Hillsborough, Orgreave, the post-service Horizon scandal, Grenfell, all share this shameful characteristic. Each one has sent out the message that ordinary working class lives don't matter. The Minister can take this opportunity to show that this Labour government does think that the lives of ordinary people do matter by ensuring that the victims of contaminated blood products receive just and meaningful compensation without any further unconscionable delay. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Liz Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak in this incredibly important debate today. I would like to begin by paying tribute to all those who had their lives destroyed by the infected blood scandal and everyone who has campaigned for justice. They include my constituent Gary Webster. For those members who are not familiar with Gary's story, Gary was born with haemophilia, and at the age of 9 he was sent to Trelaws College, a specialist boarding school in Hampshire. His parents hoped that the school's on-site medical facilities would enable Gary to lead as normal and happy a childhood as possible. All the boys at the school and their parents trusted the doctors who saw them implicitly. In fact, the boys were being given contaminated Factor VIII blood products imported from the US. Gary was in his final year at school when he was told he'd been infected with HIV, AIDS and hepatitis, and that there was no guarantee he would be alive in 6 to 12 months. Of the 122 haemophiliac boys who attended Trelaws between 1973 and 1986, 80 have since died. The Infected Blood Inquiry report by Sir Brian Langstaff found that deaths, illness and suffering were caused needlessly to people with bleeding disorders by treating children at Trelaws with multiple, riskier, commercial concentrates prophylactically and as objects for research, and treating children unnecessarily with concentrates, especially commercial ones, rather than choosing safer treatments. One can only imagine the pain of the survivors and all the families. It beggars belief that it has taken so long for them to get justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, the thousands of victims of the infected blood scandal and their families from across the UK have been waiting far too long for justice, accountability and compensation. The Liberal Democrats welcome the introduction of the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme. We are glad that it will bring the victims of this gross miscarriage of justice, including those who were infected and those who have been affected, closer to the justice they deserve. It is absolutely crucial that this compensation scheme is implemented as quickly and effectively as possible. We are also backing calls by the survivors for a duty of candour on all public officials. The Infected Blood Scandal Campaign organisation Factor VIII has highlighted that the guidance on the Infected Blood Compensation Authority website states, should an eligible affected person die during the application process to the scheme, their compensation award will not be paid. This is in line with the inquiry's recommendation. However, Factor VIII has examined the inquiry's second interim report, and in the summary of conclusions on page 14 at conclusion T, Sir Brian Langstaff says, where an affected person who has not made a claim dies, the sums that they might have received if they had claimed should not become part of their estate. The key wording is who has not made a claim. So will the government update its policy and ensure all affected persons who make an eligible claim have their claim honoured? This is of significant importance for those affected who are elderly or ill and are concerned they may not live to see the end result of the claim process. I hope the Minister will look at this as a matter of urgency. The infected blood scandal has highlighted the importance of robust blood safety measures and tools. Will the government look into the merits of pathogen and inactivation technology to ensure no one else unnecessarily suffers from infected blood, and to ensure that we have a safe, reliable supply of blood products? Madam Deputy Speaker, I spoke with Gary Webster on Friday, and as he put it, the whole process needs speeding up. After so many years of secrecy, deceit and delay, the government must ensure full transparency over the progress of the scheme and open, ongoing communication with all those affected. And for all the families who have been impacted by this appalling scandal, please give them a national memorial and the reassurance that measures will be put in place to ensure nothing like this can ever happen again.
To make his maiden speech, Michael Payne.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is the honour of my life to be speaking for the first time in this House as the Member of Parliament for my hometown of Gedling. To be given the opportunity to represent your neighbours and the place you are proud to call home in the greatest democratic chamber in the world is a tremendous privilege and responsibility. To the people of Gedling who sent me here to speak up for them, thank you. I am eternally grateful for your support and trust. In my time in this House, I will work tirelessly to repay that trust, representing each and every one of you to the very best of my ability. Madam Deputy Speaker, my immediate predecessor was Tom Randall. He and I had our differences, but the fact that two young boys who grew up in Arnold and attended Redhill Comprehensive School were sent to represent their hometown in this Parliament says so much about the power of education and the value of our democracy, both of which must be cherished and protected. In particular, I'd like to thank Tom for his work in standing up for Hong Kongers in Gedling and across the United Kingdom. At the count on election night, I promised I would continue this important work, and I'm pleased to be able to restate that promise on the floor of this House today. In 1997, Gedling elected its first Labour MP, my friend, Vernon Coker, now Lord Coker. For 22 years, Vernon served the people of Gedling with distinction. He was widely respected across this House, just as he is now in the other place. As a kid growing up in Gedling, who was inspired by Vernon visiting my school, I'd like to place on record my thanks to Vernon and his wife Jackie for their service to Gedling. Madam Deputy Speaker, in listening to inspiring contributions from members across the House since the general election, I've been constantly reminded that the privilege of being elected to this House brings with it a duty to speak up for those who feel voiceless, powerless and ignored. People like my auntie, Tara Payne, whose first husband, Thomas Muir, died on the 1st of August 2013. He died at just 55 years of age, a victim of the infected blood scandal. Thomas and tens of thousands of others lost their lives because their own country failed them. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is only because of the courage, perseverance and resilience of those affected and their families that this government has finally committed to compensating them for this horrifying injustice. The victims of the infected blood scandal have learned through heartbreaking experience that the words of Martin Luther King are as true today as when he first spoke them. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Madam Deputy Speaker, 36 years ago, if you had told the young working class boy growing up in a terraced house in Arnold, just outside of Nottingham, that he would one day be representing the place he owes everything to in the United Kingdom Parliament, he would have never believed it. And I still don't today. But Madam Deputy Speaker, the values our great country and this Parliament stand for, the parliamentarians and the trailblazers who have gone before us, mean that kids from backgrounds like mine really can achieve their dreams and ambitions, irrespective of their birthright. And during my time in this House, I promise to do all I can to ensure that children in Gedling and across the country have the best possible start in life and are given the support and education to realise their dreams and their full potential. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we are not here in this House to leave a better society for future generations, what are we here for at all? I am only able to stand here and speak from these benches today for 3 reasons: a loving family, an excellent education, and a wonderful community. Let me begin with the community I'm so proud to call home. Gedling is a constituency that may not be known by its name, but it should certainly be known by its nature. a beautiful collection of towns and villages to the northeast of the city of Nottingham and bordering the banks of the River Trent. It is surrounded by the historic footprint of the ancient Sherwood Forest and the rural beauty of Nottinghamshire County. My hometown of Arnold is a market town with a proud history of hosiery. It was the centre of the framework knitting industry in the 19th century, and it was the site for the first frame-breaking incident of the Luddite riots in March 1811. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, not that I agree with their view on technology in the workplace, but, Madam Deputy Speaker, theirs was a cause of fighting for increased pay and conditions and improved living standards, a cause just as important today as it was then. It's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to serve as a government, part of a government that is introducing the biggest advance in workers' rights for a generation. Yeah. The town of Carlton was once home to a thriving textile industry, famous for its brickworks, as well as being home to the late great actor Richard Beckinsale. It is now primarily residential, as are the smaller railway town of Netherfield, the beautiful village of Colwick, and the bustling high street community of Mapley and Porchester. Gedling is also home to several picturesque villages that form part of rural Nottinghamshire: Burton Joyce, Stoke Bardolph, Lamley, Woodborough, and the former mining village of Bestwood, where the original 1876 Victorian winding engine house still stands in its full glory. Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the work of the Winding Engine House Volunteer Group and the Friends of Bestwood Country Park. At the heart of the constituency is the historic village from which the constituency took its name, Gedling, home to All Hallows Church, whose beautiful spire was an inspiration to one of the architects of this palace, Augustus Pugin. All Hallows stands proudly in the landscape of its surroundings and at the foot of the former Gedling Colliery. Gedling Colliery was one of the most important collieries in Nottinghamshire, known as the Pit of Nations, in honour of its diverse workforce, including from the Windrush generation. It was here, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my granddad served as a coal miner. I still remember the tear in his eye when, on the 25th anniversary of the colliery's closure, I accompanied him and his former coal miners on a visit to Gedling Country Park, which now stands in the place of the former colliery, and which I was proud to play a part in creating as Deputy Leader of Gedling Borough Council. Madam Deputy Speaker, the miners of our past powered this country's future. We owe them an eternal debt of gratitude. It's why I'm so proud to be part of a government that is finally ending the miners' pension injustice. Madam Deputy Speaker, my family have lived in Gedling for generations. They mean everything to me. I grew up in a home where hard work, respect, playing by the rules and honesty meant everything. These are the values that matter to most families, and they are the values that will guide me during my time in this place. Growing up as the son of a mechanic, watching your dad work hard at 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your head and pay the bills, you learn the meaning of hard work and the true meaning of family. Growing up watching your granddad and your nana spend many years raising much-needed funds for Derrymount School, a school for children with special educational needs and disabilities, you learn the meaning of compassion and never looking down on anyone. And growing up as the son of a mum who went without so that I could be the first in my family to go to university, you learn the meaning of true love and selflessness. Madam Deputy Speaker, my politics and my beliefs are important to me, but like millions of other people across this country, nothing is more important than my family. It's for this reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, that making this maiden speech hasn't been easy. There are 2 people I desperately wish were watching from the gallery today: John Herbert Waplington and Joan Edna Waplington, my nana and my granddad. Their love, compassion, and the values that they and my parents taught me are the reason I am who I am today. They are the reason I believe in helping others. My nana and granddad were so proud to see me elected to serve my home community of Gedling Borough Council in May 2011, and they would have been even prouder to see me elected to this place to serve our home community. It's true, Madam Deputy Speaker, that love really is the greatest gift one generation can leave to another, and I'm forever blessed to have been loved by both of them. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, Gedling is full of people with compassion and desire to serve others. I've had the privilege to meet so many of them over the years. People like Helen Lloyd and the volunteers at Arnold Food Bank, Tina Simpson and the team at Netherfield St George's Centre, Nathan Kenny and Mapley All-Stars, Joel Baldry and the team at the Ark in Gedling, the Friends of Gedling Country Park, Daybrook Bowls Club, who are celebrating their centenary this year, the wonderful musicians of Burton Joyce Community Brass, and the many, many more extraordinary people and groups who make Gedling such a wonderful community. Gedling is also home to brilliant schools with inspirational teachers and staff. I spent many happy years at Richard Bonington Primary School and Red Hill Comprehensive School, and like so many other people across the country, I owe so much to my teachers for their encouragement, support and inspiration. Madam Deputy Speaker, being elected to serve my hometown in this place was the second greatest moment of my life. The first was marrying my husband, Kyle Robinson Payne, on the 1st of July 2022. I'm delighted he is here in the gallery today, just as he has been with me on every step of my journey to this place. We live in a world where far too many people continue to be persecuted for who they are and who they love. For as long as I'm in this place, I will use this platform to speak up for them and their rights. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, as our much-missed and beautiful friend Jo Cox taught us, whatever our differences, there is always so much more in common than that which divides us.
Yeah. John Glen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I first commend the speech of the Honourable Gentleman, the new member for Gedling, which I think we can all agree was a very moving speech, and he does great credit to his family and his constituents. And I would also like to apologise for not being here for the first few minutes as I was running over from Portcullis House. I had the privilege of being the minister responsible for the infected blood compensation scheme. And on the 21st of May, I brought the scheme to the floor of the House from that dispatch box. And in the previous 6 months, I was determined, not knowing when the election would be called, to do everything I could to bring that compensation scheme to life after so much delay that the member for Blythe and Ashington rightly said has been totally unacceptable for too long. And in my remarks to the House today, I want to pay tribute to the victims. I want to explain what some of my experiences were as a minister and make some observations on what lessons and next steps that may need to take place. But first of all, I'd like to also acknowledge the work of my successor, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Paymaster General, the member for Torfan. I think he has done virtually everything I would have done had I, the electorate overall, been given us a different outcome. And though I will always be available to members of the public to ask questions in this House, as would be my responsibility as an opposition backbench MP, I do believe that he is doing everything he can to move the scheme forward as quickly as possible, and I will come on to the mechanics of that in a moment. During the month of May, I participated in 18 meetings. I met representatives of 40 groups in London, Leeds, Birmingham, Cardiff, Belfast and Edinburgh. Each meeting was a profoundly emotional and moving moment for myself, and I think the officials who accompanied me. I met people who had gone through unimaginable suffering and uncertainty, not just for a matter of months, but in some cases for a number of decades. Some had been infected through their marriage. Some had been born as haemophiliacs and then been treated in ways that had consequences that we've spoken about today. Some had transfusions when giving birth to their children. Some received blood transfusions from imports that proved to be defective. Some had hepatitis C, hepatitis B. Some had HIV. Many had a combination of different conditions. And some had been family members of those who'd been infected. It was a humbling but tragic set of moments. And in those conversations, I looked those individuals in the eye and I said to them, I am sorry. I am deeply sorry on behalf of the British state. It was a great privilege to be asked to do that on behalf of His Majesty's government. But we must learn lessons collectively of the enduring failure to come to terms with what had happened over so many governments, so many decades. Now, there were many individuals I met who had campaigned relentlessly, and I want to pay tribute to them today. I'm not going to draw individual names because there are just so many people and it would be unfair to all of those I met. It was right that we brought forward a second interim payment. And it was right that we recognised the affected communities as well as the infected communities. It was very tragic for me to see how there were sometimes disputes and divisions amongst so many of the communities because so much time has passed, so much fear had existed around who would be looked after first, and therefore would there be any constraints on the money that was available. But let me just step back to the previous year, 2023, when after the Remembrance weekend I was asked to move from my long tenure in different roles in the Treasury to the Cabinet Office and become Paymaster General. And the previous year I had had some exposure to the challenge of making provision for compensation. And my immediate predecessor, the former member for Horsham, had done a lot to try and ascertain what in government collectively had been done. And the truth is, there was a very wide envelope. It may have been between 2 and 20 billion and moved around according to what analysis could be done. The reason for that was because actually understanding the parameters was fundamentally going to be based on how much you were going to pay as compensation the different groups that were infected and affected. And my predecessor started that process, and I pay tribute to him for what he did. But I also want to pay tribute to the former Chancellor, my right honourable friend, the member for Godalming and Ash, who said to me when I left the Treasury that you have one duty in that job, and that is a moral duty to resolve the compensation scheme. And I honestly believe that he was critical in ensuring that we got to where we did on the 21st of May. I also want to pay tribute to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, who did so much, just sat behind me here at every questions, challenging me on what I was or wasn't doing. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows too well, there are always constraints that his officials will say, well, I wouldn't say that at this point, and you're always trying to say more. But I was just acutely aware of how frustrated all those communities were, and that whatever I said, unless it was crystal clear, it would set off another storm of speculations on social media. On advice of my officials, I appointed Sir Jonathan Montgomery, and in the early months of 2024, he assembled a small group of technical experts to advise on how to translate the compensation study of Robert Francis into a scheme, into a full compensation scheme. injury impact, social impact, autonomy, a care award, financial loss award. How, across those 5 heads of loss, could you put a number to the relative suffering across all of those different conditions? The loss of a normal life, the loss of the ability to work, the loss of a sense of respect from the community in which you lived, and stigma, as others have referred to. Now, it was suggested to me at the time that I'd done it the wrong way round. I should have engaged with the community, and I took the view that we weren't going to get that resolved if we'd done it that way round, but I knew it was critically important, and I always had the expectation and intention that all the communities would be engaged with. And that's why on the 21st of May, when I announced the scheme to the House, I established, as then happened, in June, a series of engagements where Sir Robert Francis met with representatives of the infected and affected communities to go through the scheme and establish where there would be changes and need to be changes. And I pay tribute to my successor, who engaged with the output of that work, and as per the timetable that had been agreed, made the changes, virtually all of them, that were requested. Now, I hear today, understandably, urgings from across the House for speed to make this happen sooner, to get the payments made. And I totally understand that. I, to some extent, agree with it. But I want to reassure the House that David Foley, a superbly experienced civil servant who is now setting up and heading up, I think, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, as an arm's-length body of government, the Right Honourable Gentleman, nor could I have done, written the cheques ourselves to set up the processes, the systems, to evaluate entitlement and get money out as quickly as possible. And speed for those infected individuals of around 4,000 who are alive is obviously an imperative. The reason I took the 210,000 second interim payment decision alongside the 100,000 from October 2022 was because I was advised, and I pressed and I challenged my officials to get to a number that was the maximum that everyone would receive. But it is, of course, wholly necessary to not just get a first tranche to be fully paid out, but to get everyone else paid out as well. Now, I acknowledge that there are questions about how to verify when the date of infection occurred, but there has obviously got to be, despite all the bad things that have happened, reconcile speed and effective decision-making with also ensuring that we pay the right people who are entitled. Now, in Sir Brian Langstaff's 7-volume report, which I went to see the launch of publication on Monday, the 20th of May, he made a number of recommendations, and the Right Honourable Gentleman has indicated the government's willingness to honour those, the national memorial. I think he also asked for biannual meetings of those who have suffered, to come to grips with the duty of candour. But I want us as a House to be clear and honest about what we're really asking for here. Because when you read that report, you see that it spanned different decades, different generations of ministers, civil servants, orthodoxies in the medical profession. And what we need to encourage is curiosity amongst individuals who see things going wrong, but are held back from being truly candid about it, because there tends to be a groupthink that prevents a thorough interrogation of what should be done. Distortions happen. Recollections have varied. The medical profession, indeed, would make different judgments now than they would have done at different points in the past. And I think we need to be wise about what that duty of candour looks like going forward, but we need to grasp the core argument that Brian Langstaff makes, that we have got to change the culture across government, across public service, and in politics, where ministers, I hope the right honourable gentleman doesn't move, and if he does, I hope he moves up. But if he stays there, that he can have an impact over time. But when ministers do move, they have a received wisdom from their officials from a previous iteration. And we need to encourage the infusion of new ministers sometimes to ask challenging questions and allow that to make progress. I have some profound concerns about public inquiries, however. There's been a lot said in recent months about the multiple public inquiries that have occurred and how can we make them more systematic and aligned. And of course, the secretariats and the processes that are run obviously can be streamlined. They are presented as the only cathartic method for the British state to come to terms with something that's gone wrong. They're often not constrained in any way. They are typically led, and I have nothing against retired High Court judges, Madam Deputy Speaker, but sometimes we do need to broaden the expertise and judgments, have economists, have other people involved in looking at some of these things. To do something like this was a massive undertaking, and I pay tribute to Brian Langstaff, but 7 years of work is an enormous amount of time. And I'm not an expert on this, but when I think about the read across to the COVID inquiry, many people have expectations of what that will deliver. But in other countries, such analyses have brought forward recommendations and changes much more quickly. And I do think we've got to get that balance right, not to cover up anything, but because we end up putting things into the long grass for so long, and we need, as a parliament, to come to terms with that. I've probably spoken for too long, but I hope I can be forgiven given the role I had in this particular enterprise. But I do want to pay tribute to the work that's been done by those that are responsible for bringing this to this point. I want to pay tribute to all the victims and campaigners who have been so determined through numerous knockbacks from governments over the years. My own government, absolutely has got to take its full share of the blame for that. Interim arrangements were made. Ad hoc compensation schemes were set up. But responsibility was not taken by the British state. And it's absolutely right that we have done so now. I don't think social media is very helpful in helping us come to terms with the trauma of all of this or giving clarity to those that need it. But I wish David Foley and the IBCA well. I think there will be a series of letters about how to interpret individual recommendations, but he is setting up an efficient mechanism that will, once it starts delivering, will deliver more and more rapidly. I'm convinced of that. For some, it can't come soon enough. But I hope that very soon we can draw the right enduring lessons from this national scandal. And I hope it will never happen again. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Clive Efford.
Deputy Speaker, can I start by paying tribute to my honourable friend for his maiden speech. It's clearly special for him to represent the area in which he grew up and which he's got so much personal experience and memories, and he spoke very passionately about his family, which I'm sure they're very proud of him today. So I'm sure he'll be an excellent representative of Gedling. I remember his Labour predecessor very well. We were both elected on the same day, and you know, I could just challenge him a little bit and say you've got some big boots to fill, because he was an excellent Member of Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of how we've got here, because in spite of everything we've heard about the excellent progress that's being made in response to Sir Brian Langstaff's report, there is still an enormous amount of frustration out there amongst victims and their families. In the 1970s and 1980s, as many as 6,000 people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders were treated with factor concentrates contaminated with HIV and hepatitis viruses. Almost all of them were infected with hepatitis C, and around 1,250 people, including 380 children, were also infected with HIV. Some of those unintentionally infected their partners or other family members. More than 3/4 of those infected with HIV have since died, and around 1/3 of those infected with hepatitis C. Of those still alive, many are in poor health due to liver damage or from living with long-term HIV. Additionally, around 26,800 people were given blood transfusions that were infected with hepatitis C. All of this was avoidable. By the 1970s, blood and blood products were already known to transfer viruses. It was known that the use of pooled blood products increased the risk of infection significantly. These risks were ignored by leading clinicians, ministers, and civil servants. They failed to take appropriate action to end their use and ensure the use of safer products. Pharmaceutical companies and leading clinicians did not share appropriate information about risks with patient and patient groups. They failed in their duty of candour. No wonder that the victims of these crimes mistrust the state that should be there for them, to protect them, to be on their side. We are here because despite many dying along the way, one victim dying every 4 days, the surviving victims refused to give up, refused to be defeated. They won their battle, and over and above that, they won the right to be included in the decisions, as Sir Brian Langstaff made clear in his report. All along, the victims have been lied to, refused access to information, records have mysteriously gone missing, and more recently, they have found themselves repeatedly let down by the government, and it has to be said, in the form of the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office control the decisions, and the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, and I hear what my right honourable friend said in answer to me earlier on about they have operational independence, but ultimately it is the Cabinet Office that is making the decisions, and the victims are not included in the way that Sir Brian recommended. Victims feel decisions are being made without their involvement. Victims suffering with hepatitis C feel particularly excluded and don't feel that their suffering has been fully recognised in the compensation scheme. Sir Brian Langstaff recommended in his interim report that there should be an arm's length body, and I won't read the whole recommendation, but can I just read this? I recommend that an arm's length body should be set up to administer the compensation scheme with guaranteed independence of judgment, chaired by a judge of High Court or Court of Session status as sole decision maker. And it also goes on. It should involve potentially eligible persons and their representatives amongst those in a small advisory board and in the review and improvement of the scheme. And finally, it says permit the hearing of applicants in person. None of this is part of the compensation process, yet it is here clearly, and it's the intention of Brian Langstaff that the victims should be involved much more.
Okay, Glen. I'm very grateful to my old friend for giving way. Can I just say, first of all, in terms of listening to the victims, obviously during the general election campaign, I mean, my predecessor set it up. It continued under the aegis of civil servants in that period. There was an extensive consultation exercise, after which 74 recommendations were made, listening to the community on changing the scheme. The government accepted 69 of the 74 recommendations to be implemented. So, I really would suggest, my honourable friend, that was very much listening to concerns about the original formation of the scheme. But could I also say to him, in respect of the Independent Blood Compensation Authority, I do strongly recommend that he, as chair of the APPG, does meet with Sir Robert Francis and indeed Sir David Foley, and can speak to them about precisely the matters he's raising about the involvement of the infected blood community, which is hugely important.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of the consultation that took place, but what's described here by Sir Brian Langstaff is ongoing involvement of the victims in the process going forwards. That they are part of an advisory panel and that they continually advise the compensation board. And in regard to David Foley, I know that David Foley was at the conference at the weekend of the organisation that represents people with hepatitis, and they were very pleased with the discussions they had with him. But nonetheless, in spite of that, since then I have a communication with people who were at that conference, and they have made it quite clear to me that they do still feel frustrated that ultimately the Cabinet Office is in control of the decision-making process. And if that, and my honourable friend may take issue with that, but nonetheless, he should take note of the fact that there is that belief out there, and we need to deal with it.
Group for giving way, and he's absolutely right, and he's right to labour this point, because all that we're hearing from representative groups and those that make sure that they represent all the people who are involved in the infected or affected community is consultation with government. They just want to be listened to and properly consulted with, as all these regulations are going to be designed and going forward. So he's absolutely right, and I don't understand the Minister's sensitivity around all this, and I think he's just got to be aware, and I'm pretty certain that he is aware, that there is a sensitivity around this when it comes to the community.
I couldn't agree with him more. What I'm really trying to raise here and make my honourable friend aware of is the strength of feeling that there is out there that needs to be addressed. We are not going to satisfy people about the process unless we address those concerns. And one of the things that is driving that is that the process that we have at the moment is not what was described in the report of Sir Brian, and also not what was expected at the time that he published his reports. The victims and their representatives feel excluded, and on top of that, they feel enfeebled because of lack of resources for advice and advocacy. And I have to say to my honourable friend that there is further to go if the victims are to have complete faith in the process. There is frustration that the people they have been battling against have been put in charge of the reparations. Surely my honourable friend can see their concerns. The death rate is now 1 every 3 days, and the increase in the rate is largely due to those with hepatitis who have been suffering with long-term chronic liver disease. And now the Red Book in the budget sets out that compensation will be paid over 5 years, and at that rate, in that period, another 600 people will have died without getting justice. The Treasury must not become another reason for the delay in justice for the victims. So can my honourable friend ensure and can he guarantee that that will not be the case? Now, I'm aware that Sir Brian Langstaff has written to my honourable friend about the rule on siblings of 18 years of age at the time that their sibling passed away. Can he explain to the House, or can he write to me and explain just exactly where that ruling came from? Because it doesn't seem to appear in any of the recommendations or the report from Sir Brian Langstaff. And I've spoken before about the £15,000 offered to former pupils of Trelaw School, and this is considered by them to be derisory. In my opinion, it's another example of what happens when the victims are excluded from the process. So, can I also draw his attention to the report of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee? Their report is an excoriating criticism of the Cabinet Office, exposing what they describe as a lack of clear and understandable information in the explanatory memorandum and a lack of preparedness for delivering the compensation scheme. They doubt that the Cabinet Office will be able to pay compensation by the end of the year. So is he confident that they are wrong and that payments will be made by the end of the year? Lastly, large amounts of money were made by pharmaceutical companies and others while the victims were being exploited and in some cases even being experimented on. This did not come about because of mistakes. These were deliberate actions and in many instances criminal. The British taxpayer must not pay the full cost of this alone. Those who made money from this appalling scandal should be required to make a significant contribution. Now, I welcome the progress we have made, in spite of what my right honourable friend may consider my negative speech, but there is much further to go to deliver the justice that Sir Brian Langstaff set out in his report.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you ever so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's always difficult to follow somebody who almost says exactly what you intend to say in your speech, but what I'll try to do for you, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to rephrase it in a way that will probably be helpful and hopefully useful to the House. But I'm grateful to follow the Honourable Gentleman because he does raise a number of really important issues. And I think it's really important that this is listened carefully from the front bench. And I notice once again the Minister's reaction in response to the Honourable Gentleman. And I think it's just got to relax a little bit. What we're trying to do, Minister, is help out, be the voice of the community who are telling us these things that they want to be engaged with, that they want to be properly consulted with, they want to be part of the process. This is what they're telling us in the all-party group, and this is what we're hearing from all the representative groups right across the United Kingdom. And I think it would be hold the gentleman, honourable gentleman, just a little bit more if perhaps he took on board some of the things that we're trying to put forward, just about the feelings and opinions of a lot of the community and what they're saying to us directly as a consequence of what's happening. But I want to congratulate the government for honouring their commitment to have a debate. It's a pity we didn't get the full day. But the one thing I've noticed is it's getting a bit quieter when we're having these debates and statements in the House. And what I'm hoping for is that this isn't going to be a fatigue when it comes to discussing the important issues around the infective blood scandal and the ongoing compensation schemes and the very detailed approach that we're going to have as a House. And I'm really hoping that we're not going to get to the stage where the government see this as job done, another box to be ticked, infected blood, there we go, dealt with, and we now move on. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us who were involved in this campaign to make sure that we continue to press this to government, that we do make sure that we are talking up on behalf of our constituents and those who are impacted and affected. And I really hope that we do start to see perhaps some of the newer Labour members particularly taking a bigger interest in some of this. We used to have really involved, detailed debates and people turned up and played their part. And I'm sure a lot of them represent people who are impacted and affected by this. So it would be good to see a few of them turn up. And of course, I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I mean, I think it's a good sign that there are fewer members of Parliament here because it shows that there is meaningful progress. And I don't see from the Minister tetchiness. What I see is somebody who has actually listened carefully to representations of the community and acted on them. Now, I do accept and acknowledge that there are outstanding matters, but actually, if you've set up a campaign infrastructure for 20 years in some cases to campaign, it is quite difficult to adjust to delivery mode.
There is no one in the House more experienced than the right honourable gentleman, and I know and I've paid tribute to his what he's done in government for the way that he brought this forward, and again I do that today, and he's right, and we've got to try and be a bit careful, but I think all of us involved in this are just trying to be helpful when it comes to going forward with this debate, and he's possibly right that maybe there is a satisfaction that things have done and moved on, and we are at a different stage of the campaign, but I think it's still important that we continue to ask the questions of government, because I think that's what we're all trying to helpfully do in this debate here today. And there's a couple of issues that I want to just try to pick up a little. Yes, well, as long as he doesn't poke me in the back again like he did the other evening.
Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the outstanding issues that has to be addressed is come from my constituents, and I quote, "Current proposals only allowed siblings who, while under the age of 18, lived in the same household as an infected person for a period of at least 2 years after the onset of the infection. The requirement for the siblings to have lived in the same house should be removed. The loss and suffering of a sibling who did not live in the same household for 2 years is no less than a sibling who did." Does he agree?
I do indeed, and I'm happy that my speech has provided him with another opportunity to make one of his interventions in practically every debate that he turns up to. So, but yes, I do agree, and he makes a very good point, and I think that's something that the House has now heard. But there's a couple of issues that the Honourable Gentleman brought up that I just want to sort of re-emphasise and hopefully reinforce. And that is this arm's length process that we have when it comes to IBCA. Because the Honourable Jim is absolutely right. It's abundantly clear in the interim report and the full report that there's a general expectation that IBCA is truly arm's length, divorced and separated from government. But what we're having instead is a body that is notionally accountable to government, where I think the intention, and we can't get into the heads of Sir David Francis when it comes to how he designed, or Brian Langstaff rather, when he designed this, but I think what he actually proposed and what he suggested, and I think what he expected would happen, would we have a proper arm's length body that would be responsible to Parliament and not responsible to government. But what we have is the other way around, and that's probably going to be okay, but I think just for the extra security for us who are interested in this, I think we'd like to see the original intentions of what Sir Brian Langstaff had in mind for this and make sure that it's properly independent, because I think as long as there's a sense that this is a government body or a government influenced body, there will be the continuing suspicions from a community that's been let down so badly for decades by decision makers and governments that this is just the same old type of approach that we've had in the past. So I think what my first ask to the Minister is there still a way we could look at this to ensure that we do get that proper judge-led arm's-length body which is responsible to us as the representatives of the people of the United Kingdom and not just exclusively to government. Because what we're beginning to see already from IBCA, and again I've got no issue with all these involved and all the tributes that people have been made to David Foley and all the other people involved in this, I think it's been fantastic. But we're starting to see Cabinet Office-based appointments that are coming through, and again, we're not really seeing an involvement and consultation with those at the sharp end of all this, and I think we really need to see some more of all this. Sir Brian Langstaff said that there should be the chair of the board with two expert panels that would almost work simultaneously and in concert with each other, feeding back to the chair, one representing the legal parts of the issues and the other the health parts. And I think it would be good to see that starting to emerge when all of this comes. But the other thing that he also said, it's not as clear, but it's something that was intended, would that there would be an expert panel which would be comprised of those representing the community, that those that have been representative voices of the community, both for the affected and the effected, would have a similar type of role which would be able to feed in to the chair of IBCA. And I would like to hope that we could see some of that as we go forward again. But there is, of course, huge widespread support for what this government has done. £11.8 billion is a significant and important sum, which I'm pretty sure everybody's confident will go most of the way to deliver and meet some of the expectations that's placed upon some of the compensation addresses. But there are issues, and members have already touched on some of them, and I'll rattle through them because I don't want to detain the House. I've raised these things before, but I just want to make sure that we touch upon these as we go forward. And the Honourable Gentleman is right, absolutely right. The £15,000 for those caught up in unethical research is far too low, and this is something that's coming back to all of us again, and I would really hope that we'd be able to revisit that and have a look again. And then there's those that were treated with interferon as a matter, of course, when it came to their own particular treatment and their issues when it came to this, and they've not been properly and fully included into the compensation scheme, so I really hope that, again, the government are maybe able to look at this. There's concern that hepatitis C payment bandings don't match and reflect the suffering it's caused, and again, I've been hearing that from constituents that are involved in the campaigns, and I hope that the government may be able to look at this. There's the issue about bereaved parents and children will receive very low compensation payments if they are not the beneficiary of the estate or of their bereaved family members, and I think that's something that could be addressed. And no compensation has been paid to siblings for the loss and suffering if they were over 18. And then there's compensation for lack of earnings should consider future career progression that was prevented from occurring rather than simply existing careers that were cut short. And lastly, in my not a long list, but hopefully substantial list, is a need for a date. This need for a date of infection is causing a great deal of anxiety and confusion amongst the community. And I actually believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, most of these issues could be properly addressed if there is that full involvement of representatives of the community, that they do have that full and open access to government ministers, and that they are able to play their part in designing any future schemes. The community should be involved to help provide valuable information and advice on what the most pressing issues are and needs to be addressed. But the one thing I want to turn to in the bulk of my remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a part of Sir Brian Langstaff's report that's probably received the least attention thus far. And that is the why of all this. Why did this happen? And why were we misled for such a long time? Now, we've had the useful discussions about compensation, and it's great to see that progress, but unless we explore and examine some of the reasons why this happened, we're not going to actually learn all that much as we go forward. I know we've got the duty candour book, which I want to touch on in my remarks, and that's a useful, positive and helpful development. But unless we have a proper examination and look at what went so badly wrong, I'm not entirely sure we're going to learn the full lessons of what happened in the course of the past couple of decades. The inquiry uncovered shocking revelations about the government's handling of this issue, including failures to provide full information to those affected by the contaminated blood and the delay in acknowledging the extent of the problem. Sir Brian's inquiry found that both ministers and civil servants adopted lines to take or strategies to avoid providing full and candid responses to the crisis. This lack of openness contributed to the suffering of those impacted, leaving many victims and their families of that feeling of being unheard and ignored for decades. And I'll remember those of us that were in the House in the 90s who were raising these concerns and issues on behalf of constituents that were presenting in our surgeries, being dismissed by nothing to see here letters from successive ministers that were officiating in the Department of Health. And we were, I wouldn't say fobbed off, but we were certainly told that there was nothing that we should really be concerning about. And all the sort of serious issues that were put, there was a real sense that none of this was being taken seriously. Now, Sir Brian Langstaff recommended that ministers and senior civil servants should be legally required to provide candour and completeness in their responses to public concerns. And that now brings us on to the duty of candour bill that is promised by the government. And I think all of us that have been involved in this campaign were delighted to see that as a feature of the King's Speech. We look forward to the government bringing this forward, because the duty of candour bill, where most of it is predicated upon the response to Hillsborough, there's key issues and lessons that have been taken from the infected blood scandal and other scandals like the Horizon and Post Office. So all of us who have been involved in these campaigns will be looking forward to when that comes forward and having a real opportunity to debate and have an opportunity to design that legislation when it comes to Parliament. A statutory duty of candour for all public servants, including civil servants and ministers, would hold public officials accountable for their actions and requiring them to be transparent in their dealings with the public. Such a law would compel civil servants and ministers to act with integrity and fully disclose all relevant information, even when it may be uncomfortable or damaging to the government's reputation. During the inquiry, Andy Burnham pointed out that the government frequently employed the phrase during the tainted blood scandal, "no wrongful practices were employed" in various materials during that time and even earlier. Now, in these debates, I often reference the evidence of Andy Burnham in the Langstaff inquiry. I do that because his evidence was particularly compelling and very helpful. And I probably got more letters from him as the Health Secretary than any other member, any other Secretary of State that had the Department of Health as his major or her major jurisdiction. And he talked about those letters that he used to send out to members of Parliament and expressed his concern over the inaccurate lines provided by department officials. He believed these lines perpetuated false narratives that failed to address the needs of those whose lives had been devastatingly affected. Andy Burnham emphasised that the government's response to the infected blood issue was primarily driven by a fear of financial exposure, which he believed explained the comprehensive failure in addressing the concerns of the victims over 5 decades. And this is why I've called for a further investigation, an inquiry, if you like, into why this was allowed within a major department estate that clearly led to so many of the difficulties that we're now addressing with the various compensation schemes in place just now. And where a lot of this is touched on in the Langstaff inquiry, I think a separate look at what actually went wrong would be useful and cathartic to government, particularly as it's shaping up its own bill when it comes to the duty of candour. But I'm not here to criticise. I know it sounds like it sometimes, but I think the government have made a good start with all this. I think we're all very, very grateful for the fact that we have got that 11.8 billion to ensure that the schemes came forward. I got involved in this, Madam Deputy Speaker, for a couple of constituents that were caught up in this, and I remember those early days when we didn't know what was going on, and when we got these letters from the Department of Health, it just made the whole situation all that more confusing. And over the decades, I've got to know the communities. Some of them have come down to the House of Commons, expressed their story, asked us to ask the searching questions to the Minister, and I want to pay tribute to them today. The Scottish Haemophilia Society and the Scottish Infected Blood Forum have been excellent in the representations that they've made on behalf of their community. And a lot of the reasons that we're here today discussing this and being able to see a clear way forward is the representations that they've made, the case that they've put, and the way that they've been able to get in front of members of Parliament, to government and to ministers. And I think we should pay all due credit to what they've done in order to get us here today. Thank you.
Will Stone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to put on record my thanks to my honourable friend from Hull North and Cottingham, and also the Right Honourable Member of Salisbury, for their tireless efforts in making sure that the victims of the infected blood for their tireless efforts seeking justice for the victims of the infected blood scandal. This issue has impacted countless families, and I welcome the government's ongoing work to address it with the seriousness it deserves. Today, I want to speak to the House and share the story of Jean Anazzini, the mother of one of my constituents. Jean was a nurse who came home with a cut on her hand after a patient struggled during a blood draw. The glass syringe broke. Within just over a week, her health declined so rapidly that she was rushed to hospital, where her children, Kenneth 17 and Christine 15, had to wear fully protective gear just to visit her. By then, Jean was unable to recognise her own children. And only 13 days after receiving the cut, she passed away at just 39 years old. Christine shared her story of this with me. It is truly heartbreaking. It brought a tear to my eye. So Jean had contracted hepatitis B. The current support schemes only focus on those diagnosed with hepatitis C or HIV, leaving victims like Jean without the acknowledgement or compensation that they really deserve. These schemes were originally designed to address the most commonly identified infections, but have unintentionally excluded people affected with hepatitis B. As a result of this, Jean's daughter Christine is unable to receive any compensation or recognition for her loss. I'd be extremely grateful if the Paymaster General would look into this for me and have some further discussions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This truly has been one of our nation's worst ever scandals and injustices. Thousands of patients contracted HIV or hepatitis viruses, or both, from contaminated blood. And this was not an accident in the sense of something that couldn't be avoided, nor was it pure negligence, people being not sufficiently attentive, though there was plenty of that as well. The report is clear about systematic, collective and individual failures in identifying and managing infection risk from blood products and in the response of the health service and of government. This affects constituents of very many MPs, but it has a particular tragic depth of salience in East Hampshire. East Hampshire is home to Trelaws. It's a non-maintained special school and special college that deliver outstanding education, nurture and care to children with some of the most profound disabilities. But it was also the place where there was a terrible concentration of victims of this scandal. Because of the 40 to 50 or so haemophiliac patients there at any one time, It came to be seen as a unique research opportunity to study the disease. A haemophilia centre was established at the nearby hospital in 1972, and towards the end of the 1970s, that haemophilia centre, while still being a hospital catering to the needs of the wider community, was actually relocated to the school grounds. The inquiry report dedicates an entire chapter to the experiences of the pupils at Trelaws and how research objectives often outweighed the individual best interests of those children. The inquiry heard that of the 122 pupils with haemophilia who attended the school between 1970 and 1987, only around 30 remain alive. I've spoken with a number of my constituents over the years, infected or affected, but especially with one, Adrian or Aid Goodyear, a man who speaks with remarkable dignity and determination. And I'd just like to quote briefly from his most recent message to me. The camaraderie and unity of we former pupils, well, the handfuls of us that are left, we have stuck together to get to the truth due to the promises and the pacts we made towards our lost when they were living, as well as for their families. It has been a very, very long time waiting for that truth about a string of failures, omissions and wrongdoing. Starting with the failure to achieve domestic self-sufficiency and instead allowing the importation of higher risk factor VIII concentrates from abroad, procured via commercial arrangements in many cases that made infection more likely because they came from high-risk groups including prisoners and drug users, being complacent about the risks of hepatitis C and slow to respond to the risks of AIDS, through to conducting research on people without, in many cases, telling them, or in the case of children, telling their parents or informing them of the risks. In some cases, failing to tell people that they were infected, thus closing down the possibility of them managing the progression of their disease or its transmission to others. In other cases, being told starkly and sensitively of a diagnosis of HIV, through to the defensiveness, lack of candour, active destruction of evidence, and of course absence for so many years of meaningful apology or redress. In his statement on the 21st of May, my right honourable friend for Salisbury accepted rightly Sir Brian Langstaff's recommended 5 categories of pay awards and confirmed the additional interim compensation payments. There now needs to be clarity on the basis on which claims can be assessed and, of course, on the speed of those payments. Complainants have raised some concerns about the information sources available, and I hope the Minister, in summing up, can provide assurance that steps will be taken to ensure that there is easily accessible information to support people making compensation claims. I have been asked specifically by pupils from Trelaws to ask about the £10,000 and £15,000 amounts, which has already been alluded to by the honourable gentleman from Eltham. I think it would be helpful to have on record in Hansard an explanation of those sums of money. The inquiry also recommends, we've talked about memorialisation and the National Memorial, the inquiry also recommends that there should be a memorial dedicated specifically to the children at Trelaws and should be provided at public expense. And I hope the Minister will be able to provide an update on that, either in his closing remarks or perhaps to follow up by correspondence. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that one of the positives that can come from this generation is about the duty of candour, instituting it and institutionalising it in both letter and in spirit. The report, of course, recommends a review of the existing statutory duty of candour, which requires NHS organisations to be open and transparent about mistakes and harm in care, and that leaders in health service organisations should be personally accountable for responding to concerns about safety. I think for this generation, what we need, and I think we all welcome that bill appearing in the King's Speech, is to make this an established principle across the whole of public service, which in our different ways as parliamentarians, as members of the government, we are all involved. Nothing, Madam Deputy Speaker, can or could ever make up for all these failings, but we can, at least for now, ensure that the compensation scheme, as it is now, works as well as it can. And that we, as a state, face up to our failings so that we can truly learn the lessons and have some confidence when we say, never will this happen again.
Amanda Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we always need to remember at the heart of any public scandal are people, and so many of my honourable friends this afternoon have given tragic stories, but also stories of courage and humility. Becca, Jess and their siblings have stood and campaigned for justice alongside other brave, courageous victims and their families, for people both infected and unaffected, in loving memory of their father, Joe. Like me, they welcome the decisiveness and the commitment from this government. Madam Deputy Speaker, with families like this in mind, I'd like to just ask the Minister, will he outline when he expects the second set of regulations to be laid and how victims and their families can continue to be involved and informed of its progress and how claims will be able to be made?
Shadow Minister Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I should probably start really by paying tribute to my predecessor on these benches, who was also a government minister and the predecessor to the Paymaster General. He's done so much in this area, and I'd like to touch on a few of his comments a little bit later in my closing remarks. And I should also probably start with thanking my honourable friend, the MP for Kingswood from South Staffordshire, for opening for the opposition today. And just to mention to the Paymaster General and to the other ministers in the department that obviously they continue to have, on broad levels, our support. And that I think it should never be stopped from acknowledging the size and the scale of this, which is something that is almost unimaginable to members from across the House. My honourable friend said that justice is what we need to be, we want to see happening, Madam Deputy Speaker, and that's what I know all the victims would like to see. I'd like to also thank all of the members who've spoken in this debate today and express my agreement with what has been said. That what happened to the victims of the infected blood scandal was profoundly wrong and should never be repeated. I do believe that the establishment of the inquiry in 2017 was the right first step to do what we can to repair the damage done, in as much as that can ever actually be possible. I am pleased that the work started by the previous government in adopting recommendations put forward by the inquiry is obviously being continued by the government. And I must point out, though, how important it is for the government to stay on schedule, and that's something we'll be ensuring does happen, and start delivering payments through the Infected Blood Compensation Authority by the end of the year, as the Paymaster General outlined. It is incumbent on us all in this House to do our part to actually regain trust, because that's what's been damaged here, as well as those thousands of individual lives, trust in our state. And ensuring that those payments are going out as committed to is an important part of that. But more broadly, I'd like to reflect on the challenges ahead. Slightly before I do that, though, I just wanted to touch on a couple of remarks made by honourable members from across the House. I'll start just by mentioning the honourable member for Gedling, who made his maiden speech today. I thought he spoke he spoke very kindly of his predecessor, a good friend of mine, and the honourable member probably doesn't remember this, but I actually did quite a lot of campaigning against him back in 2014 with the honourable member for Newark when he was a young by-election candidate. Today he spoke up. He spoke very strongly of the voiceless with his personal story, and he clearly has the clarity and volume of a town crier in his contributions in this House. And so I think even if we don't always agree with him, we'll always certainly be hearing his views from this side of the chamber as well. But I certainly welcome him to his place. The honourable member for Blythe and Ashington and the honourable member for Eltham Chislehurst, who is speaks obviously with the from the APPG side, and the honourable member for Perth and Kinrossshire, all talked about various different aspects, but I think all mentioned the children who were researched on as part of their remarks, and I'm sure that the Minister will want to reflect on those in the closing comments. I would say to all the honourable gentlemen, perhaps also to just nudge the government on this, that one of the recommendations, which I think all the honourable, those three honourable members touched on, was around the patient's voice going forwards. And one of the recommendations was how the patient voice must be improved through routine collection of patient satisfaction data and funding for patient advocacy groups and charities going forwards. So perhaps that's one way that patients could continue to be involved and those affected going forwards as well. The honourable member for East Hampshire mentioned the obvious impact on his constituency of those cases, and also about the memorials required for those who'd been affected. And I hope that the Minister can touch on that as well. I would, though, just before I go on to my final remarks, just like to again reflect on my right honourable friend for Salisbury, and I think his remarks actually touched probably more broadly, not just across his department, for ministers in all departments at different points in their lives, where there is that. It is so important that we encourage curiosity versus groupthink. That duty of candour is something that we all need to really bear in mind, and particularly those who work for us as well, when there can be they can be very difficult sometimes within a political environment, sometimes to do that. I also thought his point around public inquiries was worth noting, and perhaps a Minister is reflecting on. It's obviously important that we want to get to the truth, but how we do, the speed at which we do that, and how we can achieve that, and who can do that, possibly also something that might want to be reflected on more broadly by the Cabinet Office as well. We've heard the need for stronger medical screening protocols and the safety measures to ensure that a scandal like this can never really happen again. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the need to continue to interrogate our risk assessment and mitigation measures more broadly across our health services and the government. While I settled into my new role as Shadow Paymaster General, I look forward to working with both the government to see what assistance, as well as doing the job of opposition in holding them to account, can be achieved in much the spirit as honourable members opposite have done on this issue recently too. I will be holding the government to account to ensure that we can do all we can across all areas of government to ensure the strongest possible risk assessment, mitigation and response procedures are in place. And it's important to have that considered communication with groups as well. The inquiry into this matter established that there was a failure within the AHS to properly implement informed consent and to ensure that patients at all stages of the healthcare system understood how their personal care related to larger risks as well. And while I appreciate the good work that's being done to progress on this issue, we must not take our eye across the ball in any aspect of what the government does. And I'm sure there's work to be still done, not only by the Department of Health, but also by the Cabinet Office and across government, to ensure informed consent and patient communication is working properly at all times, and to ensure that the government framework centred on our health and care system are being properly and continuously evaluated to ensure that the need for proper and holistic informed consent is not victim to complex and often disjointed system. This requires, as I say, not only to work on the health and care front itself, but also those broader governance frameworks and the work to be done to improve cross-government collaboration on this point as well. This speaks to the core component of the issue raised today, with which I'd like to express my agreement with, and that is for the government to continue to ensure the global standards for blood safety are also met and regularly updated, as was mentioned earlier by honourable members. I look forward to working here in opposition, but also cross-party, in ensuring that these regulations around the sourcing and virus detection are strengthened with honourable members in other shadow roles as well. And I'd like to, with the other measures mentioned today, ensure that this is done robustly ahead of time and not as a reactive measure, as sadly has been the case in the past. It's one of the most difficult elements of the inquiry process, such as we've gone through on this issue, to acknowledge that too often we only make the changes needed to prevent a problem when the consequences of that problem have reached intolerable levels. And again, I emphasise here the need to resist boxing issues directly today solely into their direct consequence for our health and care practices. There is perhaps a much more fundamental interrogation around our governance and practice framework is needed, as was mentioned by my right honourable friend, the member for Salisbury. I want to speak here too, as has been mentioned by numerous speakers, that the inquiry shed clear light on the continuous failure on part of institutions to properly address this issue as it came up. But we know that there were far too many cases of infected patients being distrusted, disbelieved, and at points treated with outright disrespect as well. And while again I think it's important to acknowledge the significant changes that have happened across our health systems to tackle this, we should never become complacent and always remain vigilant about the need for medical and NHS staff to be approaching patients with trust, dignity and empathy. And as I've mentioned before, ensuring that our communications frameworks and staff training properly reflect those things as well. The inquiry made clear that victims of the scandal were not only victims of institutions, but also of widespread stigmatisation and prejudice too. I think we can all agree, whatever our party affiliation, that that we should continue to progress on the good work that has happened since then and support some of those fantastic organisations that continue to take on this important activism. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to put on record my thanks to the brave victims of the scandal and their families for stepping forwards bravely and steadfastly to fight for the dignity and to fight the wrongs committed upon them, and that the fact that they should be properly recognised. Obviously, I'd like to thank the Right Honourable former member for Maidenhead for introducing the inquiry back in 2017. And I would also like to thank the inquiry and its leaders themselves for the essential work that they conducted, without which we would, I'm sure, have made much less progress and also at an even slower pace. Of course, as has been mentioned by others today, no amount of compensation will ever make up for the wrongs committed, the tragedy suffered, and of course that the many affected, for many affected, they are no longer around to see the small benefits of compensation. But I would like to offer a small amount of hope to those affected. I'm confident that here in this House, across party, and we have heard you, we trust you, and we know the suffering that has been brought upon you. You have fought valiantly and relentlessly, and I hope that you can take some comfort from knowing that it is in your fight that led to the recognition of the scale of this scandal and the action that governments of both colours have taken to ensure that it will never happen again. And I hope that history will see you having successfully avoided further sufferings of this, such as this in the future, though through your exposure of the wrongs of the past. In closing, I once again express my deep regret for the failure of continuous governments over the years on this issue, and express my support for the cause of those who continue to fight. I can assure both those who are still fighting and affected, and this House that I and my colleagues on this side of the House will do all we can to continue to work cross-party on that work that needs to be done, as we know that there is still work to be done. In the spirit of the relatively non-political nature of this debate today, I will just ask that the Minister agrees to continue to work with us on this side of the House in addressing these outstanding issues for the victims and their families, to be open about making adaptations and changes going forward to address these issues, and to ensure that in the process of undertaking compensation that we don't end up alienating segments of those involved and ignoring the suffering of those all affected. Thank you again to all of those who've spoken in the House today, to the victims and their families, and to all who have played their part in doing what they can to ensure that something like this never happens again.
Minister Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I stand here as the Minister for Public Health and Prevention, humbled and with a large degree of humility. The Department of Health and Social Care is rightly hated and despised by the infected blood community. We let them down. And for that, I am personally, and my department collectively, is sorry. I say it in a heartfelt way, because for the past decade and a half, both as Shadow Public Health Minister and as a backbencher, have raised the issue of the infected blood scandal on behalf of the campaigns and on behalf of my constituents that were infected and affected. And now I stand here as a minister in the department that was responsible. I feel it incumbent on me to give that heartfelt apology. It is too late coming for so many, but I hope those that are still here and their families and loved ones will accept it in the spirit with which I give it. I am sorry. We let you down, and we must make sure it never, ever happens again. Yeah. Can I welcome the two new opposition spokespeople today? And I want to start how the honourable gentleman finished, in assuring him that the government will work collectively and constructively with members from across the House, from whichever party they come from, whichever part of the United Kingdom they represent, because this is an issue that has stained the body politic of our country for too long, and it is incumbent that we work together across party, across artificial divisions, to make sure that we get the best deal for our constituents and their families. I would also like to thank all honourable and right honourable members who have contributed to this debate today. To my honourable friend, the member for Blyth and Ashington, my honourable friend, the member for Gedling, who made an incredibly powerful maiden speech, really setting out how he is going to be a champion for the people of Gedling in the years to come. And I can say to him that the people of Arnold, John and Joan, and his husband Kyle, are all rightly proud of him today from wherever they were viewing this speech. Can I also thank my honourable friend, the member for Eltham and Chislehurst, who has played such a pivotal role in this campaign over a large number of years, my honourable friend, the member for Swindon North, and my honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth North. And on the opposition benches, the right honourable gentleman, the member for Salisbury, who has led on this from his former ministerial position, and we thank him for the work that he did. I know sometimes I was frustrated with him from just behind where he's sitting, but I do appreciate the work that he put in behind the scenes as well as at the dispatch box. The honourable gentleman, the member for Perth and Kinrossshire, who has similarly been a tireless campaigner on this, and the right honourable gentleman, the member for East Hampshire. The infected blood scandal is one of the most appalling in our nation's history. It was an institutional failure of the highest order, spanning decades, from the National Health Service to the Civil Service to ministers across successive governments at every level. Those the public trusted to protect them fell short in ways that were both tragic and catastrophic. They let down victims, their families, and our country. And in the course of this debate, we've heard names: Sean, Gary, Thomas, Jean, Aid, Joe. A reminder of the real people, those who are deceased, those who were infected, those who are affected. Real people, not statistics. And it's important we never forget that. Victims were denied the truth. Many passed away before they saw justice. The state worked to protect itself, and they paid the price. I must also echo the tributes that honourable members across the House have made to Sir Brian Langstaff and his team. Their steadfast pursuit of the truth finally brought this decades-long scandal to light. They have set us on a path towards beginning to right the terrible wrongs that were committed. Sir Brian uncovered a litany of collective and personal failures, as many honourable members have pointed to, by sharing stories from their communities and constituencies. Each one is significant in its own right, and together, Madam Deputy Speaker, they add up to a complete disaster. He found that this national scandal could have been prevented. It was already known that these treatments were contaminated, yet the warnings were disregarded time and time again. People in positions of power and responsibility had multiple opportunities to halt the transmission of these infections, but on each occasion they chose not to act. Many in this House have campaigned for justice for a long time, giving voice to those who had been repeatedly silenced. In particular, I'd like to pay tribute to my right honourable friends, the now Minister of State for Policing, Fire and Crime Prevention, and the Welsh Secretary, the honourable members for Gower, for Hornsey and Barnet, for Newport East, for Thirsk and Melton, and the former members for Worthing West, Peter Bottomley, and Lee, the now Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, and indeed in this debate today, again, my honourable friend for Eltham and Chislehurst, the honourable member for Perth and Kinrossshire, my honourable friend for Ashington, and indeed the former Paymaster General, the right honourable member for Salisbury. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will do our utmost not to repeat the mistakes of the past. We were elected on a manifesto that committed to act on the inquiry's findings and to put right historical injustices. And the public rightly expect nothing less of this government than fulfilling our moral obligation to compensate victims, and we aim to do so without delay. In October 2022, the previous government spent £440 million on initial interim payments of £100,000 to the living infected. Following the publication of the inquiry's final report in May, a further £728 million was paid as a second interim payment of £210,000 to all UK registered living infected victims. The government has also committed in legislation to pay £100,000 to the estates of the deceased infected to recognise those who have not yet received a payment and to ensure that some of those affected are supported, such as parents, children and siblings. This scheme opened on the 24th of October 2024. But we recognise that money can never make up for the heartbreak that victims and their families have experienced, and much of the inquiry's criticisms applied to the way my department, the Department of Health and Social Care and its predecessors, operated. I will give way.
My constituent, Brendan, lost his left leg while serving with the British Army in 1979. Decades later, he discovered he'd been infected with hepatitis C during the operation that saved his life. Having talked to Brendan, while he's pleased to see the government committed to compensation, he's keen for us all to understand that because of his community's lived experience, there is an inherent distrust of the state. And so when he's told that the state will spit out a number, understandably his instinct is to not trust this process. Can the Minister give Brendan reassurances that all compensation offers will include a detailed breakdown of the data and rates used to make the calculations?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I can give her and Brendan that commitment that we will do just that, to reassure those that rightly have lost all trust in public authorities, and particularly in my department, because of the dreadful actions that led to their infection. And she has my assurances we will do what we can to reassure Brendan and many others like him that we will rebuild that trust with those who rightly have no trust left in us. I will.
To the Minister, and I'm sorry not to have been here for the opening speeches. Does the Minister recognise that there's a fundamental similarity between the way the victims of this scandal were treated by the state and the way in which the victims of the Post Office scandal were treated, and no doubt other terrible scandals too? So does the government have any plan, possibly on a cross-departmental basis, to try to educate the bureaucracy that when terribly difficult and potentially expensive things like this crop up, they should not follow this well-worn path of denial and cover-up?
The right honourable gentleman raises a really important point, and it was indeed acknowledged in opening by my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, in that this is just one of a number of scandals that follow a very similar pattern, in that when this scandal has been uncovered, the state, rather than trying to protect the victim, has tried to protect itself. And it is absolutely crucial that the state learns not just from each individual scandal, but collectively, that it is the same mindset that has led us to all of these different scandals with similar outcomes for victims. And that level of learning has to be genuinely across government. And I know my right honourable friend will be leading on that with the Cabinet Office. The Government, Madam Deputy Speaker, will set out our formal response before the end of the year, but given there is absolutely no time to waste, I want to take this opportunity to update the House on the work that's already underway to address some of the inquiry's recommendations. To prevent future harm, the Department continues to explore options to enhance candour and openness across the National Health Service, to empower patient voices. The NHS is reviewing clinical audits related to haemophilia services to identify any gaps in patient involvement, alongside work on a new clinical service specification which will set standards for services across England. And to protect haemophiliacs, the NHS has convened an expert group to hear advice from the Specialised Blood Disorders Clinical Reference Group. A dedicated task force has been set up to consider their recommendations. The General Medical Council are working with NHS England and others to look at ways to ensure lessons learned are reflected in training for doctors, nurses and other healthcare professionals. Let me be clear to the House. The Government does not see this scandal in isolation. Sadly, repeated patient safety failings have eroded public confidence in our health and social care system. So we are taking steps to fix the culture of the National Health Service. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, has been clear that we will not tolerate NHS managers who silence whistleblowers. Openness and honesty are vital to ensuring patient safety. NHS staff must have the confidence to speak out and to come forward if they have concerns. There will be no more turning a blind eye to failure. Our wider reforms to NHS performance will provide greater transparency for the public who pay for it. Measures will ensure that top talent is attracted to the most challenged areas, and persistently failing managers will be sacked. This is about ensuring the right people are in post to lead our NHS with the resources they need to do their job. And if we get this right, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will be able to look back on this moment as a turning point for patient safety and for leadership. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was in committee at the start of this, although I did have my name down. I just wanted to say to the whole House, some of my constituents in Lagan Valley were impacted by this, and it's taken them this amount of time to summon up the courage to come forward. Obviously, I'm representing them in Northern Ireland. We have talked about the Hillsborough law, the need for a duty of candour. Would the Minister agree with me that it's important that that's rolled out not just in England and Wales, but right across the UK, so as you rightly say, these families are never impacted in this way again?
I hope I can assure the Honourable Lady that whilst obviously health is devolved across the 4 nations, and I can only speak on behalf of the NHS in England on a number of these recommendations, we are, both in the Department of Health and Social Care and indeed in the Cabinet Office, working on a very close collaborative way with ministers in the devolved administrations, and indeed recently myself and my right honourable friend had a meeting with ministers from Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales to talk about how we take forward these recommendations on a 4-nation basis where possible, and with mutual support across the 4 nations where there are individual recommendations pertinent to the devolved parts of the United Kingdom. So I hope that reassures her that we are working together. And whilst I cannot comment about the health services and the changes that will be needed to the health services in Northern Ireland, that's a matter for the Minister for Health in Northern Ireland, Mike Nesbitt. I'm quite certain that they will be looking very carefully and closely at the work that we are doing here in England and indeed in other parts of the United Kingdom. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have waited too long for these actions. People have waited too long for compensation. And indeed, honourable and right honourable members have waited too long for this debate. More than 3,000 people died before they saw justice. Families and our country let down. A level of suffering which is so difficult to comprehend because questions were not asked at the time, institutions did not face up to the failings, and facts were covered up. And now we know the truth. And as we reflect, we are making a concerted effort to improve because this loss need not be in vain. I'd like, if I can, to respond to some of the questions raised throughout this debate. Other questions I'll refer to directly in the relevant part of my contribution, and should I miss anything due to time constraints, I will write to members. The Honourable Gentleman for Kings Winford and South Staffordshire, in opening for the opposition, talked about destigmatisation of HIV and Hep C. And I hope he understands that there is a very clear manifesto commitment from the Labour Party to end HIV transmission within England by 2030. Officials at the Department of Health and Social Care and at the UK Health Security Agency, NHS England and a broad range of system partners are now working together to develop a new HIV action plan which we aim to publish by summer next year. Destigmatisation will be a key part of this plan. My honourable friend, the member for Blythe and Ashington, asked about psychological support for family and friends. And I want to reassure him that NHS England has established the Infected Blood Psychological Support Service in England, which has been supporting its first patients in late August. This includes supporting not just the infected, but family and friends affected too. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to turn, if I can, to departmental failings, because the report outlines a comprehensive condemnation of the organisation of blood services, licensing decisions, blood safety and patient safety, with harm compounded by the reaction and handling of government. We recognise, and I do so humbly again, the criticism of the department I stand at this dispatch box to represent and its predecessors. And I am committed to ensuring a tragedy such as the infected blood scandal can never happen again. This government will prioritise patient safety to ensure that the NHS treats people with the high quality and safe care they deserve. Repeated inquiries and investigations have highlighted significant issues with patient safety, and this has caused a deterioration in public confidence, as I heard straight from my honourable friend in her intervention, and this is something we must absolutely fix. The Health Secretary has been clear that we will not tolerate NHS managers who silence whistleblowers. A culture of openness and honesty is vital for ensuring patient safety. We want NHS staff to have the confidence to speak out, and we will give them that. On blood safety, the Honourable Member for Eastleigh raised the question on the safety of blood products. And whilst no medical treatment can be completely risk-free, current safety standards for blood donation and transfusion are rigorous, and England's blood supply is one of the safest in the world today. Throughout the blood donation journey, there are processes in place to ensure the safety of blood and blood products. These include the donation safety check form, testing for specific infections, donor deferrals, regulations and informed consent. According to Serious Hazards of Transfusion, the risk of serious harm because of blood transfusion in the United Kingdom is low, at 1 in 11,000 blood components issued. So far, in turning to timelines, Madam Deputy Speaker, so far over £1 billion has been paid in interim compensation payments to victims of the infected blood scandal. And as we heard earlier, that on the 24th of October, applications opened for interim payments of £100,000 to the estates of deceased people whose deaths have not been recognised. Parliament has now approved regulations that give the Infected Blood Compensation Authority the powers necessary to pay compensation through the core route to the infected, both living and deceased. The Infected Blood Compensation Authority has begun its process to process its first claimants under the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme. I will give way.
In the intervention on the Honourable Member for Perth and Kinrossshire, I asked about those who qualify for siblings' point of view. Those one sibling seems to be worth more than another sibling, and to me that's absolutely wrong. Has the Minister, I understand there's been no reply to that in his summing up, maybe he's coming to it. If he is, I apologise, but I'd love to have a response to that, because my constituents have asked me to ask that question and ensure we have a response. Please, thank you very much.
I can assure the honourable gentleman, the member for Strangford, that the Minister for the Cabinet Office is carefully considering this, and if he might, he will write to the honourable gentleman, but he is considering that. We expect the Infected Blood Compensation Authority to begin making payments to people who are infected under the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme by the end of this year. Payments to the affected are expected to begin in 2025, following a second set of regulations. And in turning to a question raised by the honourable gentleman, the member for Perth and Kinrossshire, on IBCA independence, IBCA is rightly operationally independent. Parliament would expect the government to have oversight of a scheme, clearly, of this size and proper management in terms of the amount of public money that is going into that. But it's true that there are only two non-government departmental bodies that are independent of the government. One is IBCA and the other is the National Audit Office. And I think that independence is absolutely the right thing to have. Madam Deputy Speaker, subject to parliamentary approval... I will give way.
The National Audit Office is accountable directly to Parliament through the Commission, and so is it the intention to create a similar sort of arrangement as envisaged by Sir Brian Langstaff, that there is direct accountability to Parliament, not to the Department?
I think I should clarify to my honourable friend, it is operationally independent, and I think that's important. But of course, in terms of scrutiny, it's absolutely right that members of this House are able to scrutinise the operations, the working, and indeed the use of the public money, because we're talking about a great deal of public money here, and it has to be democratically accountable to this House, albeit operationally independent of ministers and of government in its day-to-day business. I'll give way.
Minister, because this is a really important point. Both myself and the honourable member from Eltham have now raised this with him. He's rightly identified the experience of so many people caught up in this crisis, the fact they do not trust government and government institutions. Would it not be more of a sort of comfort to them to know it would be like the Public Accounts Office and it would be accountable to Parliament rather than being accountable to government?
I agree with the honourable gentleman, which is why it's operationally independent, and that's, you know, the crucial thing here. It's not got the fingerprints of ministers all over it, because that's where the distrust is. So it operates independently, but it is accountable as a public body to this House for how it spends that money and how it operates as an organisation. So whilst it's operationally independent, to ensure that there is separation between the executive ministers and the functioning of that body, it is accountable to this House, and I think that is absolutely the right balance. I will give way.
Can I endorse what the Minister has said with respect to the way this has been set out? This seems to me an entirely sensible arrangement that respects the need to have some distance from government, but clearly there cannot be a bespoke arrangement for every single entity that's set up. And this was the point I was trying to make respectfully about Sir Brian Langstaff earlier, that he did a brilliant job, but some of these aspects will need a slightly different judgment made by ministers, and I welcome the decision that he and his colleagues have made.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I hope that, you know, across the House, across all quarters, people can see, members can see why we have set it up in the way we have. For precisely that reason, we have to have that operational separation from ministers and the executive, but absolutely political oversight from all quarters of this chamber, because this is a public body spending public money, and a great deal of public money at that. Madam Deputy Speaker, in terms of the regulations, as I've said, we are aiming for the second set of regulations to be in place by the 31st of March 2025. This will support our intention that payments to the affected begin next year. There are important details, especially in consideration of Sir Robert Francis's recommendations, the majority of which the government has accepted, which must be worked through ahead of this second set of regulations. This includes details such as the eligibility criteria for people who are affected and how the government should define the parameters around the definition of unethical testing. If I can turn to payments, the selection of who has been contacted for first payments was a decision for the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. The first group of people who are receiving invites to claim are those who A, are known to be already eligible for compensation, B, registered with support schemes, which means we are likely to have much of the necessary information for these people already, C, from areas across the UK, D, who represent a range of infection types and severity within those infections. If I can turn to some of the other questions that were raised in relation to this particular area. The Honourable Lady, the member for Eastleigh, mentioned people dying before compensation is awarded, and I hope I can reassure her that where a person with an eligible infection has tragically died before receiving compensation, we will ensure that their personal representatives can claim compensation on behalf of the deceased estate. And I hope that clarifies that point for her. My honourable friend, the member for Swindon North, talked about the exclusion of victims with hepatitis B from the compensation scheme. People with chronic hepatitis B and those who die in the acute period are eligible for compensation, as are their loved ones as affected. Can I suggest that my honourable friend writes to the Minister for the Cabinet Office with his constituents' details, and we can look more closely at his particular case. And my honourable friend, the member for Eltham and Chislehurst, was asking about payments by the end of the year. And the answer is yes, and as I've said, and to the affected from next year when we have the new regulations in place. And the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman for East Hampshire, steps taken to give an accessible information about compensation, and I want to spell out to him that it is Sir Robert that recommended that there should be a higher award of £15,000 for children who were subject to unethical research at the school in his constituency, and that's why there is a difference there, and I hope that clarifies that particular point to him. And as I've said, Madam Deputy Speaker, at the start of November, the Infected Blood Compensation Authority invited the first cohort of people to make compensation claims. On candour in the civil service and in government, which is something that my honourable friend, the member for Eltham and Chislehurst, and the honourable member for Perth and Kinrossshire raised in their contributions, the King's speech set out the commitment to bringing forward legislation to introduce a duty of candour for public authorities and public servants. This legislation will be the catalyst for a changed culture in the public sector. And the Prime Minister confirmed at the Labour Party conference that legislation on duty of candour will be delivered by this government. He confirmed that the duty will apply to public authorities and public servants and will include criminal sanctions. The bill will be introduced to Parliament before the next anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster in April 2025. In closing, today I hope the House has heard how we are starting to deliver compensation and how we are starting to respond to the inquiry recommendations. Admittedly, they are still small steps, but ones that are in the right direction. This work, Madam Deputy Speaker, is far from over. We owe it to the victims and to their families to see it through, and we will of course regularly update the House as it progresses. And I want to reiterate again, on behalf of the Government, of the Department of Health and Social Care, and of myself, as a mere ordinary Member of Parliament for Gorton and Denton, who represent some of the infected and affected. We are truly sorry. We let you down. We will learn from these lessons. We must never, ever let anything like this happen again.
The question is that this House has considered the infected blood inquiry. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes